All right. Howdy, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another installment of Wild at Work, a stewardship series. Today, we have Mr. Shane Kiefer, the CEO of Plateau Land and Wildlife Management, joining us. Shane will be discussing the importance of the open space tax valuation with a special focus on 1D1 wildlife and its crucial role in protecting Texas lands. Shane will give us a little history of the company, Plateau Land and Wildlife, and the history of the open space wildlife tax valuation. We do ask that participants remain muted with their cameras off throughout the remainder of the presentation. If anyone has any questions, you can use the chat feature on Zoom. There's a little chat button that you should be able to choose and type in the chat. And then Shane will hopefully have some time here at the end of his presentation to tackle some of those questions. Shane, with that, I can go ahead and hand the reins off to you here. If you want to share your screen, I will stop sharing mine.
You bet. Thank you, Jared. All right. Are you seeing what you should be seeing, Jared?
Yeah, it looks good.
All right, perfect. Thank you. All right, thank y'all. Welcome, everybody. I am pleased to be here. Always pleased to work with TWA, and I'm a fan of the Wildlife at Work webinar series. I watch it myself often, so happy to participate and be here. Hopefully, provide y'all with some useful and interesting information today. Jared ran through the topics I'm going to cover, I should have plenty of time for questions at the end. Please put those in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can once we wrap up. I'm going to start with why I'm sitting here. Always like to know why people are talking to me. So if you aren't familiar with Plateau, we're a private company. We've been around over 25 years now. Our founders, David Braun and Burl Armstrong, worked with the TWA-led coalition to establish the wildlife management valuation law back in the mid-90s. We've got a staff of wildlife biologists who are also registered property tax consultants. That is an odd combination you won't find very often. It is pertinent to the talk today, actually, because I'm going to talk about this interesting intersection in Texas where we've got conservation incentivized by property tax breaks, which is a pretty special and highly impactful way to incentivize conservation in a private land state. We've got a staff of field technicians as well that deliver work on the ground. We've worked in a lot of Texas, over 7,000 landowners, almost 1.5 million acres in about 60% of the counties in Texas. We've covered a lot of ground in Texas, been doing this for a long time. Our sister firm, if you're not familiar, is Braun and Gresham. I wanted to mention them for a couple of reasons. They also, as our sister firm, give us a unique insight into legal issues that affect rural landowners as well. I'll mention it because it's so pressing for this year. Properties that are held in LLCs and LPs. If you own one or you know somebody that does, or if you have an LLC or an LP, I want to make sure that y'all are paying attention to the new Corporate Transparency Act rules. This is something that attorneys at Braun and Gresham are stressing with us as we work with landowners. And they've got blog posts and information on that. If you've got any questions, feel free to throw that out too. And it's not the topic of this talk, but it is critical. There's an end of year deadline for this, and the concern is there's just not enough word out about that topic these days. So on to the topic at hand. I use this slide in a lot of ways, and for a lot of different presentations. And I use it today because it's a really good example of a couple of important Texas values, and that's private property rights and landowner autonomy. Right? We really do respect in this state the right and the ability of the landowner to use their property for what they see it's best fit for and what they want to do with it. And that value system makes it difficult in a private land state at times to incentivize things that the community may want, which is wildlife habitat, good healthy ecology, open space, scenic views, because those may conflict with individual landowners' own desires. And so we don't use a heavy-handed approach in Texas. We don't say you can't do this, you can't do this with your land, generally. So we need to find ways to incentivize folks in order to do things that are good for both their land, but also good for the state as a whole and the all the citizens of that state. Because as you all know, every drop of rainfall in this state pretty much falls on private land. Every drop that runs into our rivers and streams and creeks, it's either falling on or passing through private land at some point. And so it's critical that we've got good, healthy, working, and open space lands in this state. And so, how do you incentivize folks to do that? Other than handing them money, which is one way to incentivize people, right? That typically works up to a point. But even then, if you're handing them money, a lot of folks, we see a lot of landowners who they'll turn down money if it limits what they can do with their property. And so Texas has come up with a particularly creative way to incentivize private lands conservation. It's been around for a long time. It's been around since 1979, and that's our open space tax valuation. Right. This is taking a very unique Texas thing, which is high levels of private land ownership. We're not the only state with high levels of private land ownership, but certainly way up there, 95+%. We're taking that Texas characteristic and combining with something else Texas is known for, which is property taxes. That's how we fund our local governments, our schools, our counties, our cities, mostly through property taxes. And because of that, and because those taxes are tied to the land, we've got a unique opportunity to incentivize what is done on that land. Not to tell folks what's done, but to incentivize what's done. And it's significant. I'm going to tell you all today, if you take nothing else away, I want you to appreciate that this program is the most significant conservation incentive in the state by volume and by dollars. So if you take open space in general, and I'm going to tell you, these numbers are numbers I calculated. They're rough averages across a very large state with lots of variety in land values and tax rates and all sorts of things. But these are pretty rough averages. They're not far off, but they're my numbers based on comptroller data and tax roll data, and all open space, ag, timber, wildlife, all combined. You're looking at about $7 billion in incentives each year for open space lands. That's a lot of money, right? And it's not cash we're handing out, but that is the incentive, the level of incentive we're giving folks. Wildlife management lands alone, about 350 million in tax incentives annually. Now that's a good deal at about $50 an acre. If you take the lands that are subject to this and the incentive that they're given in tax breaks, it's about $50 an acre. You cannot buy land anywhere for $50 an acre. You can't implement most conservation practices for $50 an acre, right? Even something like conservation easements, which are very effective ways to protect lands long term, are going to cost you more generally than $50 an acre. So very, very cost effective way to get incentives into the hands of and the structure is already there because we're going to have property taxes anyway, right? We're going to have a property tax system, a bureaucracy to administer that. And so this doesn't require its own independent bureaucracy to implement. It's already built into the system. And so it's very cost effective to deliver these incentives. No money's changing hands. Which means it's a lot simpler to implement. That's true of most conservation programs. Not handing out cash, there's typically a lot less paperwork involved. Now that $50 an acre is a good deal. I am going to spend time talking to you about why that's a good deal for all of us, in addition to just being cost effective, what those benefits are. And we're going to get a little bit into detail about what wildlife is, just to cover the basics and make sure that we're all on the same page. But I'm going to talk about open space. Okay? So here are the options. You may be familiar with these. You may know all of them. You may know some of them. But there's four basic options for open space in Texas. That's agricultural production, right? That's the one that everybody thinks of first. It's cows, sheep, goats, growing crops. As of the last 15 years or so, bees are an agricultural use, beekeeping, which has become really popular. So agricultural production is the first one most folks think of when they think of open space. Timber production, if you live out East Texas, you think of timber production too. Very, very common out there. An ecological laboratory, which if I venture if you haven't heard of one of these, it's probably that one. I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end, just so you're familiar with it and its importance. And then the newest one on the block is wildlife management. It's been around for almost 30 years now. But again, these other three, agricultural production, timber production, and ecological laboratory, those were the three original open space uses way back in 1979. Wildlife management's a newer kid on the block, even though it's been around for a long time. Wildlife management came along at a time because of, again, TWA and a lot of forward thinking individuals. It is becoming increasingly important as we see smaller and smaller parcels, smaller and smaller land holdings. Wildlife management is beginning to shine, and I venture to say we got it at a really good time for it to build momentum because it's going to be increasingly important going forward as we get into sizes of lands that just aren't as productive agriculturally, but we still want to protect and maintain in open space. So I'm going to spend most of the time talking about wildlife management, but I wanted to introduce these four options to you. How do you decide what's right for you? It depends on what you want out of your property. These are questions that I ask most landowners we're working with. The first question is, what do you want to see out of your property? What are your goals? It's critical not only to decide what type of open space works best, right? If my primary interest is producing a commodity and that's all I care about, agricultural production is going to be the way for me to go. But I may have other interests too. I may be interested in recreational enjoyment or hunting or leaving a legacy for my family. And none of these things are mutually exclusive, but you've got to balance some of them. And so understanding which ones matter and what the priority is critical, not only for deciding what type of open space, but also for deciding once you pick, if you pick wildlife or ag or whatever it may be, what's the best way to go about it? That these goals inform that as well. So I put those up there just to think about it. And what we know from Texas land trends over at A&M Natural Resources Institute is that the reason people are buying and holding land now is less about commodity production, right? Agricultural production or timber production, and more about these recreational or legacy or personal enjoyment factors. And so that's important to consider. It's another reason that wildlife management came along at a really good time in this state's history. So we'll talk about wildlife management in particular. It has grown substantially in 30 years. We've seen a pretty good acceleration over the past probably 15 to 20 as well. These numbers aren't old. It's hard to get up-to-date numbers. And it takes the comptroller usually at least a year to get stuff together. And then a little while to get it to you when you ask. So I'd venture to say now we're almost certainly over 7 million acres statewide in wildlife management valuation, and probably close to 2 million acres in the Edwards Plateau. Texas Land Trends should be updating their data really soon. But as for now, 2017 is the most current stuff. So that's a fantastic website. You should visit it if you've got interest in working lands in Texas. So it's not evenly distributed across the state, right? The Edwards Plateau makes up a smaller proportion of the state than that 1.5 to 2 million acres in wildlife would be out of the total. And that's because it's particularly well suited. And again, having these options, these choices for landowners to make for themselves is part of the strength of the open space tax valuation. Because your property may not be well suited to agricultural production. It may not be what you want. And a lot of the Edwards Plateau isn't terribly productive. There's a lot of folks moving here, tend to be smaller parcels these days, smaller tracts these days. And so the option of wildlife management becomes really valuable for keeping as much of that land intact as possible. So it works particularly well in certain parts of the state where either tract size or productivity or both don't lend themselves well to other forms of agricultural use or timber production. So let's talk about the benefits before we get into the details of what wildlife management is, which I will talk about. But I want to make sure y'all understand the benefits not only to you as a landowner, but also to the community at large, because I think that's really important when we're talking about something that, again, is funded by tax incentives. It's important to know what the rest of us are getting out of it too. Benefit to the landowner. Most folks are well aware that open space is a heck of a tax deal. It is, aside from a total exemption from taxes, which if you're a religious organization you can get, or in some cases there are a few other full exemptions, total exemptions, disabled vets, things like that. All good. But aside from a total exemption, there's not a better deal than an open space valuation. These are real numbers. This is a real property in Williamson County. 53 acres, $1.2 million market value. If they were paying taxes on the market value, it'd be about $23,000 an acre, about $400 per acre. Sorry, $23,000 per year in taxes, about $400 per acre in taxes. You can imagine the incentive, the difficulty in maintaining this. If there's no income off this property, or even if there is some income, the difficulty in maintaining this keeping this property intact, just to pay the taxes. Under open space, you're looking at about $2 per acre in taxes, right? About $100 tax bill. Again, there are no structures on this property. This doesn't include any homes or any other structures. This is just raw land. And so if keeping this 53-acre property intact is important to the landowner or to the community, this is a really strong incentive. That's a lot more than that $50 an acre that I mentioned earlier. And I told you that was a real broad act across the state as a whole. Again, one of the real powerful features of this is that the incentive gets even stronger, where you've got stronger incentives to sell and develop land. Because land values, that's as land values climb, the incentive gets stronger. And so if I'm gonna resist selling this 53-acre property to development, the stronger my incentive is, the more likely I am to keep it intact. And so again, one of the beauties of the approach. So what about the benefit to the community? I don't think these numbers get talked about enough. I try to show folks these numbers as much as possible. I think it's really important to understanding why this is a good deal, beyond the fact that it's a cost-effective way to incentivize folks. Why is it a good deal for us? Why should we incentivize folks with property tax breaks for open space, to keep land in open space and in working lands? This is by the American Farmland Trust. This is what they call their cost to community services studies. And it can be a little complicated to understand at times, but hopefully I can get this across to you in a way that makes sense. Essentially, the first number, the dollar, on the left is tax revenue, $1 in tax revenue. And what this is telling you is that for a residential property, my house, your house, for every dollar in tax revenue I pay, it costs the government, city, county, road and bridge, emergency services district, all those, it costs those government entities about $1.10 to $1.26 to provide all the services that my property needs as an individual. That's a net loss. You're not going to make that up in volume. No chance. So, and I'd venture to say that this, as and I very much appreciate the increased homestead exemption personally, absolutely. But I'd venture to say that gap gets wider the more we pull off of those residential properties, right? You still have to provide the same services to them. So who's paying the bills, right? Well, commercial properties are paying the bills for every dollar in revenue tax revenue that they pay in. It's costing about 20 to 30 cents to provide services. Makes sense, right? A large warehouse or business district got a very high tax valuation, high property tax bill. Not a lot of services. You got roads, obviously, you got services to provide, but it's not the same as providing it to a neighborhood. What's most interesting, and the point of this slide in this presentation, obviously, is those working in open space lands. And I want to make it clear that this ratio includes the fact that they're paying reduced property tax valuation, that they're paying that $100 on that 53 acres in Williamson County, right? So it includes that. And even with those low tax valuations, it's still a net gain for everybody. For every dollar in services, it's only taken 18 cents to 33 cents to deliver services to those open space lands. David Langford of TWA said it best. This is why, right? There's not a lot of services to provide to raw land. Think about this property again. This 53 acres in Williamson County. Nobody living there. It's raw land. What services, government services, does it require? Very little to none. Right? There's a road to get to it. But other than that, it's not demanding much in services. So even at that low tax rate, it's paying in more than it's taken back. Really, really important. It's a positive and cost efficient way across the board. What other benefits? This is a fact of life in Texas now. I'm sure you've heard it, you know it. But this is a real simple illustration of it. This is right on the Hayes-Travis County line. These are parcel lines, right? These are lot lines from the appraisal district. And that yellow circle is about 3,000 acres. And in 2004, there were just a few dozen landowners that controlled and managed that 3,000 acres. By 2017, there were several hundred landowners that were responsible for that 3,000 acres. That type of fragmentation is going to continue to occur. Texas isn't getting geographically bigger, but we are getting a lot more folks moving here, right? And so as folks move here, as they need places to live, as they want to own land, they're going to buy land. It's going to get smaller by necessity. So what can we do to address that known and very significant issue of keeping good wildlife habitat intact and keeping wildlife corridors intact? And what I posit to you here, and what I want you to think about, is that ownership fragmentation, which is what you're hearing about here. That's what we're talking about. Doesn't necessarily have to equate to habitat fragmentation. It often does. They often go hand in hand, right? Because individual owners are going to have different opinions and goals about what to do with their property, and they may be building commercial centers on it or houses or whatever else. So ownership fragmentation often results in habitat fragmentation, but it doesn't have to, because essentially parcels are just lines on the map, right? These lines on this map don't necessarily disturb habitat until the individual owners take action to use the land for something other than open space. And I can tell you what I can tell you about this particular section right here is that a lot of these properties, while these very large tracts have been broken into smaller tracts, a lot of these properties are in open space of some kind, either ag or a lot of them in wildlife management. And so you don't have the level of habitat fragmentation that you might get if they were otherwise used for residential subdivisions, things like that. And so what I want everybody to think about is, can good management mitigate that ownership fragmentation? If I own 100 acres and I sell it to 5 of you, well, there's 5 people now making decisions where it used to just be me. And you've got your 20 acres and she's got her 20 acres. And but if you're all incentivized incentivized to do good things for wildlife through a property tax incentive, that's likely to be better, have better results than otherwise, right? So you've, instead of just having your 20 acres and not being concerned about whether it stays actively managed in open space, I can give you a little bit of an incentive, a property tax incentive to do activities. Again, we'll talk about what level, but there is a level of activity required for wildlife management. If I'm giving you an incentive to be actively managing that property, we're all going to be better off. Even if you're not managing for the same species, even if you don't have the same ideas about what you're doing on your property, you're going to be managing for wildlife habitat, native wildlife in general, and that's a good thing for that 100 acres than otherwise. So I told you I mentioned ecological laboratory. This is, again, a particularly unique open space use that is never going to be as widespread as the others. But again, it's a real win-win, and it demonstrates the power of a property tax incentive. And this program, this way that we decide, or that we found to incentivize private landowners in the state. These numbers are from one firm. It's from Braun and Gresham, our sister firm, and they're not the only ones that have worked in this space. But that one firm alone has gotten over 33 universities access to over 86,000 acres of private property in Texas. And again, being a private property state, access for research is really important. Access to understand the ecology of our state better, the wildlife of our state better. Access to private lands is critical for that. And this open space program helps provide that. Not only that, most of these landowners are actually actively funding this research. So they're paying in for the promise of a future tax break. And so it's a big win-win for the universities, for the students who are trying to learn and provide further our knowledge. And it's a win for the landowners, helps them keep that land intact long term. So what's wildlife? We talked about all the benefits, and I may be preaching to the choir in this case, but I think understanding the details of why it's such an important and valuable program is valuable, and I hope you'll go out and spread that word as well. So here's what the law says, and we can do a whole other presentation on the details of the law and rules. But this is the basis for it all. It's in the Constitution. Section 1D1, that's why it's called 1D1 open space. The important word in this is shall, okay? The legislature shall provide for taxation of open space land. That means they have to, right? It doesn't mean it's an option. It means they can't just take it away by changing the law. The Constitution says you must provide for taxation of these open space lands devoted to these uses. And so it's solid, and that includes farming, ranching, and wildlife management. Interestingly, timber is a may. Not that timber's under attack by any means, but that's a little bit of trivia there. Timber is not required by the Constitution. It's allowed by the Constitution, timber use. Agricultural and wildlife management are a shall. They must be provided for in the law. Doesn't mean it can't tweak the law, but it does mean it has to be there in some form. Really, really important. Again, been around for about 30 years now, almost 30 years now. So what is it? It's an alternative agricultural use. Under the tax code, under the law, wildlife management is just a type of agriculture. That's all it is. Because of that, it must have a current ag or timber valuation in place before you're eligible to move to it. Part of the deal was this was going to be no net loss in property tax revenue, right? And so to accomplish that, they said, all right, well, only lands that have qualified previously for open space, that have gone through, built their history, qualified through agricultural production or timber production, beekeeping, before those have to happen first before property is eligible for wildlife. And that's simply a way to keep things kind of revenue neutral from the beginning. The taxable value stays the same. This is a revenue neutrality thing too, right? You don't get a bigger break for being in wildlife. Your taxable value stays the same as whatever class you were in before. If you were in native range productivity value before, you stay in native range productivity value. If you were in a timber, pulpwood productivity value, you stay in a timber pulpwood productivity value after you move to wildlife. You must manage for native wildlife. It only applies to native species. And you have to perform 3 wildlife practices annually out of 7 categories. So there's a lot of practices available under those 7 categories, more than 50. So there's a lot of choices, a lot of options to choose. Again, this is about freedom of choice, the ability to be flexible, the ability to do what you want to do on your property while incentivizing you to keep it intact and keep open space open as much as possible. But it does require activity. Having the world's greatest wildlife habitat doesn't do anything for you on the property tax break if you're not actively doing things on it. You don't get it just because your property is a great wildlife property. You have to do stuff regardless. Those minimum requirements, 3 out of 7. These are the 7 categories, right? It's a separate topic to go through these in detail and talk about them. We do that frequently in the free webinars we put on. So, and I'm happy to answer questions about them. But it's its own hour to talk about these individual categories and what's appropriate. And it's going to depend on what's right for your property. But things like habitat control, things like brush management, you see here in this picture. Supplemental shelter could be things like nest boxes or brush piles. Supplemental food may be something as simple as a feeder, like you see here, or it could be things like planting food plots. So there's lots and lots of flexibility in these 7 categories, and it's important to note that you want to choose things that are right for your property and your target species, and that fit your particular needs. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. I'll encourage you all, if you're in wildlife or if you're thinking about wildlife, don't do the minimum. Take a step or 2 beyond. We recommend find 5. It's usually not hard. Usually when I get to a property and I'm advising a landowner, they're already doing 3 or 4 just because they enjoy them. And so finding 4 or 5 is not hard to do. And that gives you a little bit of insurance in case things don't go like you planned, which often happens when you own land, right? Weather conditions, equipment failures, lots of things contribute to not being able to do things that you plan to do in a year. And so having 4 or 5 activities gives you some cushion and some insurance. Before you start, you should talk to a biologist. That's what we do, but we're not the only ones doing it. You've got a fantastic group of biologists at Texas Parks and Wildlife working for you, funded by your tax dollars, that are available to talk about these things too. NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service, the Texas Forest Service will do forestry plans for private landowners in parts of the state you wouldn't expect to find the Texas Forest Service. They do excellent work. So there's lots of resources available. But you should talk to a natural resources professional, biologist, before you start. Even if you don't use them to build your plan out, it'll help you. Number one, so you can avoid any unnecessary actions, right? Avoid spending money where you don't need to. That's really important. You want to pick activities that are feasible for your property and your target species, right? Also key, I see that when I review plans that landowners put together. Oftentimes it's activities because they've got such passion and high hopes, they're choosing activities that may not be entirely feasible for their property. You want to make sure you pick a target species that's appropriate for your property as well, right? So if you've got 15 or 20 acres, you can do lots of good things for deer. That's probably not going to be your primary target species. It's just not enough land to actively manage for a population of deer. You may choose some things, again, that benefit deer, but you're going to need to pick species that are appropriate, species that actually occur in your area and may use the habitats that are present on your property. It's really important. Ask questions. when you get if you can get a biologist or a professional. Don't just sit back and listen. Ask questions, actively ask questions, so you understand your property better and understand what works for you. And then think about what when you. I told you to first think about those goals, right? That we hit up at the top. What do you want out of your property? But think about what level of commitment you can give to the property. Wildlife is extremely flexible, and it can fit folks that are out on the property every day and folks that only get to visit occasionally. There are ways to get those activities done. Just depends on the activity and the level of intensity that's required. So think about that. You're going to be living there. That changes what activities you may do. What about equipment? Do you have equipment available to do some things, but you have to buy equipment to do other things or hire folks with equipment to do other things? Does that fit your budget? Are you going to be conducting the activities? You can hire somebody else to do it. So all those things matter. You should think through all those things when you're picking activities to put in your wildlife management. And here's an example. Here's one of the reasons why talking to a professional is important. We have to get creative all the time about how we use these activities because the Parks and Wildlife guidelines, which dictate what the available activities are at times vague or not specific to your situation. And here's an example. Under the Parks and Wildlife guidelines for feeders and mineral supplementation, this is what the requirements are. Right? One free. This is for Edwards Plateau, by the way. One free choice feeder for 320 acres with a minute 16% crude protein. See Appendix F for deer. This only relates to deer, but supplemental feeding isn't restricted to deer management. You can supplemental feed a lot of different wildlife species. And so if you're an individual working off this, where do you go? What do you need to do? How much do you really need to do to benefit your target species? And this is the case with a lot of things in the guidelines, and that's not a knock on the guidelines themselves. Parks and Wildlife they can't address every possible situation with guidelines. The guidelines are already several hundred pages. They'd be thousands of pages if they tried to address every possible scenario. So it's really important that they are flexible, but it also takes some experience and knowledge to understand how it might apply best to your particular situation. And you don't want to leave activities on the table. You don't want to find out that something you've been doing could have counted as an activity, but you didn't know how to apply it. So just another reason to get help when you're doing this stuff. Let's talk about target species. What I'll say about this. It is wide open. If it is native to the state of Texas and it is an animal, invertebrate, vertebrate, doesn't matter, then it can be a target species if it's appropriate for your property. The most common ones, of course, we run into a lot. Game species. That is, people love deer, quail, turkey, and doves. I do too. I love chasing them. I love looking at them. I love managing for them. But we have just as many, if not more, folks that want to manage for songbirds for viewing purposes. Again, highly appropriate for small properties where larger species or species that need larger ranges may not work well. Pollinators have gotten exceptionally popular over the last, particularly decade or more. A lot of people interested in. That's fantastic. There's a lot of good things you can do for pollinators on a small property and have a big impact. And it's another example of one of those. If I've got 5 landowners on that 100 acres I had, and they're managing for pollinators, I've got a lot of pollinator habitat, even though it's scattered amongst 5 owners across that 100 acres. Things that aren't target species are anything that's non-native, right? Feral pigs, and you can manage feral pigs as a predator. Right, so removal, control of feral pigs is a qualifying activity, but managing for their benefit is not qualifying target species. Exotic species, axis fallow, blackbuck, those sorts of things. It doesn't mean that you can't have them on your property, but it does mean that you need to ensure that you're balancing what they're using with native wildlife, and that you're managing in favor of native wildlife and exotics. That's really important. Much more common as we go west, but popping up more and more elsewhere too. So exotic wildlife, even though we call them exotic wildlife, are not wildlife under this law. So how do you make the switch? The filing period is between January and April, which is past, as you noticed. It's May 22nd. It is not too late for this year. You are permitted under the law to file up until the rolls are approved. But you will be assessed a 10% penalty. That's 10% of the difference in your taxes between market value and open space. And that can be quite a bit of money, but it's a lot better than not not having your valuation anymore. It's a lot better than paying market value. So you can file late. Rolls are typically approved around mid-July, but it can be early July, it can be late July. So that's not a hard date, and it varies by appraisal district. But there is a possibility to file late. But generally, your filing period is January 1st to April 30th. Now's a good time to start thinking about 2025. If you're in ag and you've got it and you're thinking about this, 2025 is a good place to look for next year filing after January 1. Your steps, we talked about these, but as a recap, you got to be qualified for open space first to move to wildlife management. There's no way around it. Whatever your qualifying use was, bees, cows, goats, crops, it doesn't matter if it's qualified ag timber, you can move it to wildlife management. Minimum acreage. I should have made this asterisk really big because it's important. And I want y'all to make sure you take this away too. So I'm going to try to stop clearing my throat and speak real clearly. If your property has not changed since last January 1st, there is no minimum acreage requirement, period. End of sentence. Nowhere in the state, no appraisal district anywhere. If your property hasn't changed size since last January 1st and it's qualified ag land, it's qualified to move into wildlife no matter what size your property is, period. That's really important. You will hear other things from some appraisal districts or from some other folks. That's not true. The law is very, very clear on this, but it does get confused with some other things at times. So it's really important. If you ever hear something contrary to what I just told you, I want you to call me personally, and we'll talk about it. It's right. Now, if your property has changed since the last January 1st, you are subject to minimum acreage requirements to move to wildlife, and those vary by appraisal district and by region of the state. So there are cases where minimum acreage applies, but it is not universal. Really important to understand. You have to create and submit a management plan and an open space application. Again, between January 1st and April 30th, unless you're filing late. And then you're going to implement your plan and you're going to document the plan. And that documentation is really important. It's difficult. It's more difficult for an appraisal district to tell if you're actively managing for wildlife than it is to tell if you're actively grazing property, right? And so because of that, your documentation is really critical. I'm going to tell you your documentation is really critical in any open space, right? Again, this is a significant tax incentive, and so it gets attention from appraisal districts at times, and especially in high value counties. And so your documentation is your insurance that you are earning this valuation. This valuation is not a right. It's something you have to earn by what you do on your property. And so it's really important to document those things, regardless of whether it's wildlife or ag or timber. So make sure you're documented. For wildlife, that's pictures, that's a log of what you did. May 22nd, cut small cedar with hand loppers over 2 acres of the back pasture. Right? That's my log for the day. That's what I did. That's my documentation that I'm actively implementing the plan. And really important. Back to this picture. I'm going to wrap up. We'll have time for questions. This picture, this fence line contrast, what we call this. Again, I use it in a lot of cases because it illustrates a lot of different things. And some of it's just land use choices. Both of these properties being in open space, it's better than having concrete on top. But as properties get smaller, as tracts get smaller, especially in parts of the state like the Edwards Plateau, but anywhere in the state, as tracts reach a certain size, it gets harder and harder to keep them in agricultural production. And wildlife management provides an alternative to being required to graze a certain number of head on land that may not be able to sustain it, for instance, because it's too small. Wildlife allows us to continue to provide that incentive to keep that space open and hopefully intact and connected to other open space properties, even if they're small next door. And so as we see more fragmentation, I think we're going to see wildlife become more and more, wildlife management valuation become more and more critical for healthy lands in our state. So regardless of how you decide to use your property, thank you all for taking care of your piece of Texas. It's really important and for encouraging others to do the same. And I want to thank you all for joining and listening to me. I hope you got something useful out of that. And if you didn't, then please ask a question and I'll try to make it useful for that purpose as well. If you need me or Plateau, this is my contact information. You can find us on our website. You can find me and all our staff there as well. So don't hesitate to reach out if we can ever be of service or if you have questions. We'll always pick up the phone and answer and get back to you if you have questions, whether you work with us or not.